If ever you go to Berlin, go down the main highway through the Brandenburg Gate, a little further on down the Unter den Linden, and then look to the left, and you will see a large museum called the Museum of Pergamon. And inside you will find Satan's residence. A German archaeologist at the end of the 19th century transported it stone by stone to Germany and rebuilt it. Here are the steps up to the temple. Here are the three sides of the column. That's the size of the temple. Now imagine all this built on a 1,000-meter Sugarloaf Mountain, towering above the surrounding countryside. From here you could see miles and miles. And this was Satan's seat. It's like a huge armchair. It is a throne. And Jesus says in the letter to Pergamum, I know where you live. That's where Satan resides. That's where Satan's seat is. And you are now looking at Satan's seat. This does not mean that he is now residing in Berlin, though Christians in Berlin have gathered by the hundreds here to pray that it may go back to Turkey. Turkey wants it back, as others want things back from the British Museum. Many Christians have the idea that moving this to Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century had a profound effect on Germany and what happened in the last century there. Whatever. I'm quite sure Satan is not living here now, and don't all come and ask me afterwards where I think he's living now. I have my ideas, but they're only my speculation, and that's not worth listening to. However, to go back to the map we had, this had an amazing influence on the churches in the area. The churches that were nearest to Pergamum had one kind of problem. As you move further away from Satan's residence, the churches had a different kind of problem. And the two churches furthest away had a very different problem from the others. To put it simply, the two churches that were nearest to Satan's residence were both being corrupted from the inside by idolatry and immorality. The next two churches further away were both suffering not from the inside, but by persecution from the outside. And in both cases, Satan was using the Jews to persecute the Christians. And Jesus even dared to call their synagogue a synagogue of Satan. The Jews were used in the earliest days of the Christian church to persecute the Christians. Truth is that in the earliest days, Paul himself and his converts and the churches he founded were quite bitterly attacked by Jewish people. They saw these Jews believing in they saw the Christians as believing in a false Messiah. They did not believe that Jesus was the Christ, and that was the root of their hatred of the Christians. So, the two churches that were furthest away from Satan, he wasn't bothering at all. So what went wrong with those two? Well, one was Ephesus, and they had lost their first love. And the other was Laodicea, and they had become lukewarm. And churches that have lost their first love and become lukewarm, Satan doesn't bother them at all. He doesn't need to. They're not a threat to him. They're not likely to attack his kingdom. They will just carry on as they are. So have you got the picture? Pergamum, Satan resides. That's his base on earth. Why would he choose Pergamum? I've given you the answer. This area was the most important area in the whole world to control. It sat right over the east-west road. The road between Europe, Asia, and Africa passed right through here. Whoever controlled this situation could control the world, could influence the world. From here, news went out in every direction to all three of the continents of the then known world. Can you begin to see how strategic it was? Satan certainly thought so. He said, that's where I can control the world. And Jesus thought the same. And so we have here a direct conflict. The church is caught in a spiritual battle, and it's going to be very fierce. So we have Satan, Pergamum, then we have two churches being attacked from the inside by Satan through idolatry and immorality, compromise within the church. Then you have a little further away, Satan attacking churches from the outside and even using God's chosen people, the Jews, to do it. They are the two churches about whom Jesus has no criticism whatever. Jesus has nothing but support and sympathy for churches that are suffering. His major criticisms are directed at churches that are not suffering for him. I find that interesting. And particularly those two churches furthest from Satan that Satan doesn't need to bother with, Ephesus and Laodicea. We're going to be looking in more detail at those two in a moment. But have I painted a picture for you? Remember that this is the end of the 1st century AD. We're into 2nd and 3rd generation Christians. And I'm afraid church history is full of examples of a church that was full of enthusiasm and life at the beginning, but gradually, as they failed to pass on that zeal for the Lord to the 2nd and 3rd generation, the church becomes respectable, cool, not very loving, still doing all the right things, but somehow the fire has died down. Satan doesn't bother with those churches. Now, on a very simple principle, I look around the world today and I say, where are these kinds of churches? And I've come to the conclusion that Satan's headquarters cannot possibly be in America, or Britain, or Europe. I see the signs of his activity in the third world. That's where the church today is growing most rapidly, and where the tensions and spiritual battles are most fierce. So somewhere in the third world, I believe Satan has his residence today. I'm not going to be more specific than that. But when I look at some of the lukewarm churches and some of the loveless churches in our Western world, I know that Satan wouldn't even put them on his list that he needs to pay attention to. They're really not much threat to him. Well, now let's move on from that history and geography lesson, but you see how the background is so important when we come to the book of Revelation. And because these are second and third generation churches, Jesus is really facing the acid test of whether his church is going to remain faithful to him. Quite simply, if the churches could survive here, they would survive anywhere. If the churches could get through the end of the 1st century AD in the pressure of Greek and Roman culture and the money and the pleasure and everything going on here, strangely reminiscent of the modern world, they had everything that you've got on television except the television set. They had drama, they had comedy, they had sport, they had everything that people are watching in the Western world today, but they had to go out for it and watch it in situ, whereas we can lounge at home and switch it on and watch it in comfort. That's the only difference. The preoccupation of the leisure life here was exactly what it is in the world which you and I live in. Their great growth industry was leisure, and it is ours too.